the merchant from Citium stood at the rail of his ship as it crossed from Phoenicia toward Piraeus, his cargo of Tyrian purple stowed below in heavy amphorae, dye worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime of labor, somewhere off the coast of Attica, in weather that the ancient sources do not name, but that we may imagine as the abrupt Aegean squall any sailor of that sea would recognize. The ship broke and the cargo went down, and Zeno walked into the harbor of Athens carrying nothing he had set out with. He was perhaps 30 years old. He had been a man of property in the morning and was a stranger in a foreign city by evening, and he wandered into a bookseller's shop on a side street because he had nowhere else to be, and what he read there in the next half hour would reshape the philosophical history of the Mediterranean for the next 500 years. This is the story of how a man who lost everything walked into a bookshop and read his way into a different life. It is also, and more importantly, the story of a principle that the Stoic school would carry forward from this moment, refining it through Cleanthes and Chrysippus, through Seneca and Epictetus, through Marcus on the Danube. The principle is this: that catastrophic loss, properly received, is not the end of a life, but the door into the only life worth living. That what we call ruin is often only the violent removal of what was preventing us from seeing. We are told by Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries later in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, that Zeno himself spoke of the shipwreck in this manner. "I made a prosperous voyage," he is reported to have said, "when I suffered shipwreck." Consider the structure of that sentence. The grammar refuses the obvious reading. The voyage that sank him is the prosperous one. The cargo lost in the sea was not, in the final accounting, the cargo that mattered. One must consider how strange this claim is. We are accustomed to think of loss as the negative term, the thing that happens against the grain of what we want. Zeno's sentence inverts the accounting. He does not say that he made the best of a bad situation. He does not say that he recovered. He says the loss itself was the prosperity. The ruin was the gain. The Stoics after him would develop this thought into one of the school's central doctrines. Externals are not the goods we suppose them to be. Wealth, reputation, health, the ships we own, and the cargoes we carry across the wine-dark sea, these are not bad, but they are not what we are. They are, in the school's technical term, indifference. They may be preferred or dispreferred, but they do not constitute the human good. The human good is the right use of the rational soul. Everything else is borrowed, and the loan may be called in at any hour. Let us be careful here. The Stoic does not say that loss is pleasant. The Stoic does not pretend that the merchant who watches his fortune sink into the Aegean feels nothing, or ought to feel nothing. The doctrine is more subtle. It is that the loss, however painful in the moment, has shown the merchant something he could not have seen while he still possessed his cargo. It has shown him that he was never the cargo. He was the man who happened to own it, and the man remains. This is the principle the episode will pursue. Catastrophic loss as the doorway to philosophy. Not loss as motivational fuel. Not loss as the prelude to a more successful second act, but loss as the violent removal of a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding that we are what we have. The misunderstanding that the voyage exists for the sake of the cargo. To see how Zeno arrived at the bookseller's shop, we must place him in his world. Citium was a small Greek city on the southeastern coast of Cyprus, settled originally by Phoenicians. By Zeno's time, a mixed community of Greek and Semitic populations. Zeno's father, Menasseus, was a merchant in the dye trade. The dye in question was the famous Tyrian purple, extracted from the murex sea snail, by a process so laborious and so foul-smelling that the cities which produced it were known by the stench of their dye works from miles away. Thousands of snails yielded a few grams of dye. The finished color was reserved by custom and later by law for the garments of kings and senators. To trade in murex purple was to trade in a substance more valuable by weight than silver. Menasseus traveled often to Athens for business, and the ancient sources tell us that he brought back books for his son. Among them were the Socratic dialogues, the memorabilia of Xenophon, perhaps some of the writings of the Cynic school. Zeno, we are told, read these from boyhood and was drawn to the figure of Socrates, the man who asked questions in the marketplace and would not be moved from his post by fear of death. But the family business was the family business. Zeno grew up to be a merchant, as his father had been, and at some point in his late 20s or early 30s, he set out on the voyage that would bring him to Athens, carrying his own consignment of purple. The ancient accounts differ on the details. Some sources say he was sailing from Phoenicia to Piraeus. Others say from Cyprus directly. Diogenes Laertius preserves several versions, as he often does, and we are left to imagine the voyage in its general outline. What we know is that the ship did not arrive. The cargo was lost. Zeno reached Athens with his life and very little else. He was, by the standards of his time, no longer young. 30 was middle age in the ancient Mediterranean. He had been formed by a merchant's training, the accounting of weights and shipments, the management of slaves and crews, the negotiation of prices in the markets of Sidon and Tyre and Alexandria. He had been shaped to a life that no longer existed. The cargo that defined his standing was at the bottom of the sea. The credit he might have drawn on in Athens was credit owed to a man who no longer was the man the credit had been extended to. He wandered. The sources tell us he found a bookseller's shop, sat down, and began to read. The book in his hands was the second book of Xenophon's memorabilia, the dialogues of Socrates with his students. He read, we are told, with such absorption that he asked the bookseller where men like the one in the book might be found. As it happened, the philosopher Crates of Thebes, a cynic of the school descended from Diogenes, was passing in the street. The bookseller pointed and said, "Follow that man." Zeno followed. He became Crates' student. He studied cynicism for years, then moved on to other teachers, Stilpo of Megara, Polemo of the Academy, the dialecticians, and the Platonists, gathering instruction from every school in Athens. And around the year 301, before the Common Era, perhaps a decade after the shipwreck, he began to teach his own students in a covered colonnade on the north side of the Athenian agora. The colonnade was called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, decorated with frescoes of the Battle of Marathon and the sack of Troy. From this porch, the school took its name. He taught there for the rest of his life. He never returned to the dye trade. He never, so far as we know, set foot on a merchant ship again. He lived simply. The Athenians, who came to honor him in his old age, voted him a golden crown and a public burial. He refused much of what they offered. When he died, by some accounts, at nearly 100 years of age, he left behind a school that would shape Roman thought from the Republic through the late Empire, a school whose doctrines would still be read in the bookshops of Alexandria and the libraries of Constantinople long after his name had become legend. The shipwreck, then, was the hinge. Without it, Zeno would have remained a merchant. With it, he became the founder of Stoicism. He himself, in the saying preserved by Diogenes Laertius, named the shipwreck the Prosperous Voyage. He named the ruin the gain. We must ask now what this principle looked like in practice. What did Zeno do with the loss? How did the catastrophe become the doorway and not merely the catastrophe? The first thing we observe is that Zeno did not try to recover what he had lost. There is no record of him writing home for funds, no record of him seeking patrons to stake him to a new cargo, no record of him attempting to reconstruct the merchant's life on Athenian soil. He had been a man of business. He could have written letters. He could have leveraged his father's contacts. He did none of this. He sat down in a bookshop and read. This is harder than it sounds. The instinct of the ruined man is to rebuild what was lost, because the lost thing is the thing he knows how to want. The merchant knows how to want cargo. He knows the rhythm of voyages and the calendar of markets. To lose the cargo and immediately set about replacing it is to insist that nothing has been learned. The loss becomes, in that case, a mere interruption, an inconvenience to be repaired. The structure of the life remains untouched. The man who set out is the same man who returns, only poorer. Zeno did the harder thing. He let the loss stand. He treated it as information about the life he had been living, rather than as a problem to be solved within the terms of that life. The bookshop is the second observation. He did not, in his ruin, seek out the harbor, or the warehouses, or the offices of the dye merchants. He sought out a place where men sold the records of how to think. Diogenes Laertius preserves the small detail that the bookseller was a man named Philiscus, and that the book Zeno read was Xenophon's account of Socrates. We may suppose this was not entirely accidental. Zeno's father had brought him such books from boyhood. There was in the merchant the seed of another kind of man. The shipwreck did not plant the seed. It only cleared away the cargo that had been growing over it. The third observation is the seriousness of his apprenticeship. Zeno did not become a philosopher overnight. He did not write a book in the first year of his loss and announce himself a sage. He studied for a decade or more, moving from Crates to Stilpo to Polemo, learning the Cynic doctrine of indifference to convention, the Megarian doctrine of logical rigor, the academic doctrine of the good. He took instruction. He sat under teachers who corrected him. When at last he opened his own school, he opened it as a man who had served a long apprenticeship to the question of how to live. The shipwreck was the doorway, but Zeno did not stand in the doorway congratulating himself on having passed through it. He walked into the long discipline that lay beyond. There is a saying attributed to him in the ancient sources, brief and characteristic. Well-being is attained little by little, and nevertheless is no little thing itself. Consider the patience of that sentence. The well-being of which the Stoics speak, the eudaimonia that is the goal of philosophical practice, is not a sudden conversion. It is the accumulation of small disciplines over long years. The shipwreck opens the door, but only the walking gets you anywhere. We should pause over the question of what Zeno was actually learning in those years of study. The Cynics, under Crates, taught him to despise the conventional goods, wealth and reputation, and physical comfort. They taught him by example. Crates himself had been a wealthy man who gave away his fortune and lived in the streets of Athens, sharing his cloak with his wife Hipparchia, who had renounced her own family's wealth to live as a cynic alongside him. From this school, Zeno learned that the goods most men chase are not goods at all, only customs the strong have agreed to honor. But cynicism was, in the end, too narrow for Zeno. The Cynics were anti-philosophers, mockers of the schools, refusers of system. Zeno wanted to know why the conventional goods were not goods. He wanted the argument, not only the gesture. So he moved on to Stilpo and the Megarians, who taught him logic and the rigor of definition. He moved on to Polemo and the Academy, who taught him the Platonic vision of the good. From each school, he took what could be made rigorous, and what could not be made rigorous, he left behind. The Stoicism that emerged from this long synthesis was a system, a complete philosophy with a physics, a logic, and an ethics, each part supporting the others. The ethics taught that virtue is the only good and vice the only evil, that externals are indifferent, that the wise man lives in accordance with nature, which is to say, in accordance with the rational order of the cosmos. The physics taught that the cosmos is a single living being, pervaded by logos, divine reason, of which the human soul is a fragment. The logic taught the discipline of judgment, by which we sort the impressions that strike the mind into the true and the false. All of this came, in some real sense, from the shipwreck. Not because the shipwreck contained the doctrine, but because the shipwreck made the doctrine possible to learn. The merchant could not have learned it. The ruined merchant could. We are told that Zeno was thin, dark-skinned, slightly stooped. The Athenians called him the Little Phoenician. He drank water, ate simple bread and figs, wore a thin cloak even in winter. When the king of Macedon, Antigonus Gonatas, came to Athens and sought him out, Zeno received him as he would have received any other student. When Antigonus invited him to the Macedonian court, Zeno declined, sending 2 of his students in his place. He was, in his old age, exactly what his philosophy described, a man whose well-being did not depend on the externals others pursued. He died, the sources tell us, in an unusual manner. Leaving the school one day, he stumbled and broke a toe. Striking the ground with his hand, he is reported to have quoted a line from a lost tragedy. I come, why dost thou call for me? And he held his breath until he died. Whether the story is literally true, or whether it is the kind of legend that gathers around founders, we cannot say, but it carries the school's signature. The wise man knows when to leave. The wise man is not held by the body any more than he is held by the cargo. What then is the structural lesson? What is Zeno actually teaching the listener who comes to him across the centuries? The lesson is not that you should hope for catastrophic loss. The Stoics never taught that suffering is good in itself, and Zeno did not engineer the shipwreck. The lesson is something more difficult to state clearly. It is that the goods we believe we possess are not always the goods we actually need, and that we are usually unable to tell the difference until the false goods are taken from us. The merchant believed his cargo was his life. He had been trained to believe it. His father had trained him. His city had trained him. The markets of the Mediterranean had trained him. He sailed with his identity stowed in the hold of his ship. When the ship went down, he discovered that his identity had not been in the hold. His identity was still standing on the deck, or rather, still standing on the shore of Piraeus, having survived a thing he had thought he could not survive. This is the doorway, not the loss itself, but the discovery that follows the loss. The discovery that you are not what you have. The discovery that something in you persisted through the ruin of everything you had organized your life around. That persisting thing is what philosophy addresses. That persisting thing is the proper subject of the long discipline. It is thus that we must read Zeno's strange saying, "I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered shipwreck." The prosperity is the discovery. The cargo was not the prosperity. The cargo was the obstacle to discovering what prosperity actually was. The lesson sharpens when we consider what most men do with their losses. Most men, having lost a cargo, set about replacing the cargo. They borrow, they scheme, they recover. They emerge from the loss, looking very much like the men they were before the loss, only chastened perhaps, and more cautious about future voyages. The loss has taught them nothing they did not already know. They knew before the loss that cargoes could be lost. They know it more vividly after, but the structure of their lives is unchanged. Zeno did not do this. Zeno let the loss instruct him. He took the shipwreck as evidence about the nature of cargoes, and not merely about the particular cargo that had sunk. He concluded that any cargo could sink, that the sea was always there, that to organize a life around something that could sink was to organize a life around the wrong thing. So he stopped organizing his life that way. He turned to what could not sink. What cannot sink, in the Stoic account, is the rational soul's right use of its impressions, the judgments you make, the discipline you maintain, the integrity with which you meet what arrives. These are not in the hold of any ship. The sea cannot take them. Pirates cannot take them. Tyrants cannot take them, though they may take everything else. There is a further turn to the lesson, and we should not avoid it. The Stoic claim is not merely that the soul survives the loss of externals. The Stoic claim is that the soul is only fully visible when the externals have been removed. The cargo, while it remained, obscured the merchant from himself. He could not see what he was, because what he had was always in the way. The shipwreck cleared the view. This is why the Stoics speak of voluntary practice in the same breath as they speak of catastrophic loss. Seneca, 3 centuries after Zeno, would recommend periodic poverty as a discipline. Set aside some days, he writes to Lucilius, in which you eat the meanest fare and wear the coarsest cloak, so that you may ask yourself, "Is this the thing I feared?" The answer, when the practice is done honestly, is that the feared thing is not as fearful as imagination made it. The mind had been organizing its anxieties around a phantom. Zeno's shipwreck was the involuntary version of Seneca's practice. He did not choose the loss. The loss was given to him. But what he did with the loss was the same thing Seneca would later recommend choosing. He let the loss show him what was beneath the loss. He did not flinch from the showing. And so, the structural lesson stated plainly, catastrophic loss is not a defect in a life. It may be the only event capable of opening certain doors. The doors do not open by themselves. They open under pressure. The pressure of having the cargo taken. The pressure of standing in a foreign city with nothing in your hands. The pressure is unpleasant. The Stoics never said it was not. They said only that when the pressure comes, you may receive it as catastrophe, or you may receive it as instruction. The choice is yours, and almost nothing else is. Most receive it as catastrophe. They spend the rest of their lives explaining the loss, complaining of it, attempting to repair it, reconstructing on the same foundation, the same kind of structure that the loss revealed to be insufficient. A few receive it as instruction. They walk as Zeno walked into the bookshop. They sit down. They read. They follow the man the bookseller points to in the street. This is the doorway. The Stoics did not invent it. They only noticed that it existed and named it and built a school around the noticing. Let us close in the quiet manner of the founder. Zeno's saying, preserved across the centuries by Diogenes Laertius, comes to us in a single sentence. I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered shipwreck. We have spent this hour unfolding what that sentence contains. We have walked through the harbour of Piraeus and the bookshop of Philiscus and the colonnade of the painted porch. We have followed the merchant from Citium through his long apprenticeship into the founding of a school that would outlive him by half a millennium. But the sentence is, in the end, addressed to you, not to the historical figures who came after Zeno, not to Cleanthes who succeeded him, not to Chrysippus who systematized him, not to Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus who carried his thought into the Roman centuries. To you, sitting where you are sitting, listening as you are listening. The question Zeno would have you carry from this episode is not a question about shipwrecks. It is a question about cargo. What are you carrying in the hold of your present life that you believe to be the prosperity of the voyage? What have you organized your days around? What consumes your attention? What would, if it were lost, leave you standing on a foreign shore with empty hands? And the harder form of the question, the form Zeno himself faced in the bookshop. If that thing were taken from you by storm, or by accident, or by the slow attrition of years, what would remain? What is the part of you that the sea cannot reach? Have you given it any cultivation, any apprenticeship, any of the long discipline that the well-being of the soul requires? Or have you assumed, as the merchant once assumed, that the cargo is the voyage, and the voyage is the life? You need not answer now. The question is the kind that asks itself slowly, over months and years, as circumstance teaches what argument cannot. The Stoics did not require sudden conversions. They required only that you begin to notice. The noticing is the apprenticeship. The apprenticeship is the doorway. And the doorway, as Zeno discovered on a winter day in Piraeus, has a way of opening when it is needed, sometimes from outside, sometimes when you have not asked. I made a prosperous voyage, he said, when I suffered shipwreck. Sit with the sentence. Let it do its slow work.